So, like I said, the most famous of the people associated with this movement was Malcolm X. He was born Malcolm Little, but he does take the X as the last name, as Elijah Muhammad teaches, in honor of those ancestors whose identity had been lost. During the 1960s, he's going to be the one to really come to leadership within the Black Muslim movement. He called for the freedom of blacks by any means necessary. So if that meant using force, he was okay with that. He criticizes those who he feels are working towards racial integration. He's like, no, that's not good. Why are we trying to integrate? We should separate completely. So he's going to push for black separatism. There's an element of black nationalism. Take pride in being black and don't try to become part of mainstream culture. Who cares? If they want to treat us badly, let's treat them badly, separate and form our own identity in our own republics, in our own states, if you will. He was very, very critical of Martin Luther King, even saying that Martin Luther King was weak and ineffective. Look at how little change this man has made. He might be a great speaker and he might be a great role model, but he's not making any difference for us. These would all be Malcolm X type of arguments. Some considered him to be too radical. They're like, you're pushing too hard for too much violence, for too much change, for too fast. And he was, criticized for speaking out against Martin Luther King, who had endeared himself to many. So what's going to happen is Malcolm X is going to wind up going on what's called a Hajj, which is a religious pilgrimage. As part of the teachings of Islam, once in your life, all able-bodied Muslims are supposed to go to Mecca, which is their holy city. So he takes this Hajj to Mecca. When he comes back, and this is in 1964, he had kind of dialed down some of his more radical leanings. He had this, what he said was a greater acceptance of the universal humanity of all races. He really had softened, and the religious experience had kind of taken him over. And so he's really going to dial down, and he's going to start saying, we need to just find this middle ground. We need to have more progress than what civil disobedience and nonviolence is teaching, but violence isn't a solution either. That doesn't make us any better off. It makes us on the same level as those who commit violence against us. So he actually is going to break away from the black Muslims, who are still very, very radical, and he's going to start calling for unity among all people. So he almost kind of comes to Martin Luther King's level. And at one point, he actually considers teaming up with Martin Luther King. The two of them working together, he thought, could make a lot of great changes. But before this happens, he does wind up getting assassinated by 3 black Muslims who were angry at him for having left the organization. That being said, he does leave behind this legacy of, just a different take on the same goals of the civil rights movement. Black Muslims weren't the only other group dissatisfied with peaceful civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King. Others were questioning, is integration a goal that should be achieved? We're all sitting here saying, let's work together so that all the races work in harmony. But some were like, why should we even do that? I mean, we've got white people who are leading the civil rights movement. How do they know what we're experiencing? It's their view, and so why should we work with them? Maybe we need to break free completely. There were also some within the civil rights movement who were upset that when civil rights leaders that were white were murdered, the media turned these into martyrs. But when you had the blacks who were the black leadership who were murdered or beat, they were often neglected within the media. And so black nationalism is going to spread. And this is, again, the idea of let's really get back to our African roots, our African heritage, and promote that. And we're not going to try to integrate. We're going to try to break free. And so this really becomes this dichotomous position within the civil rights movement of, should we work towards segregation and do so peacefully, or should we work towards breaking away and is violence the method? In 1966, James Meredith, who was the one that we talked about who graduated from the University of Mississippi, he is going to try to kind of bring the two together. He's like, I'm just going to go for a little walk, kind of like Forrest Gump feeling here. I'm just going to go for a walk, and I want to see what happens. And then maybe that'll make up my mind which of these two movements is correct. And so once he graduates from the University of Mississippi, he engages in this journey across the state. He's like, I'm just going to walk across the state. On the second day of the march, he gets shot. He lives, he's wounded, but he gets shot. this is really going to inflame a lot of the civil rights movement workers within the area. In particular, Stokely Carmichael is going to come forward, and he's like, why are we, why are we supporting this man's journey when we don't really see what we're gaining? And he just got shot. So Stokely Carmichael is going to try to convince the NAACP to leave the support of Meredith. And it's only mildly successful. A lot of the people in the NAACP were like, he's just taking a walk and he's trying to be peaceful. What's the big deal? Another group that was kind of at the time working in tandem with the NAACP was called the Urban League. Carmichael does convince the Urban League to abandon Meredith's journey. And so this is where the NAACP is going to split a little bit with this Urban League led by this man, Stokely Carmichael. And the Urban League is going to become more militant. So a group of NAACP breaking away, forming their own group, inspired because of Meredith. Carmichael's going to go around, give a whole bunch of speeches, and he's basically going to say, what do you guys want? He'll flat out ask that question to the audience. What do you want? And they started chanting Black power. We want power for ourselves. We want power for our race. We have been held in bondage for too long. And so Carmichael starts, chanting Black power, Black power. And this was like their little motto. Martin Luther King did not like this. He's like, this is not at all what I'm going for here. I'm not looking for Black power because then it sounds like you want to be dominant over the white people. That's not what we want. We want to work together. And Carmichael's like, really? That's what I want. And so he's going to embrace the Black Power movement and start calling for Black separatism. Break away completely. This is going to include the idea of racial pride. Let's re-explore African traditions and African culture, music, dress, those types of things. This is when the book Roots is going to be written, where you have Alex Haley research his heritage all the way back to Kunta Kinte in Sierra Leone, and it traces everything that happens to him and his ancestors through the slave trade, and it really broadens, Americans, like white Americans' understanding of what the slave trade was like. And all of this is going on at the same time. And so it just kind of becomes this whole heated movement of, why are we trying to integrate with these people who are treating us so badly? Let's strengthen our efforts and break free if that's what we have to do. This really appealed to yet another group, because we haven't had enough yet. And this group is going to be called the Black Panther Party. It's going to be created by two men, Bobby Seale and then Huey Newton, although Seale is far more the face of the party. And he creates the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. And they declared their goal to be, Black people will not be free until we are free to determine our destiny. Towards that goal, the Black Panther Party wanted to create a Black army to protect itself and its race from the, quote, tyranny of white Americans and to defend their community from racist police oppression. This is going to result in flat-out gun battles between the Black Panthers and the different police forces that came into contact with Black Panthers. And so this is where it really heats up in terms of violence. You got the Urban League, you got the Black Muslims, you got the Black Panthers, and they're all promoting, let's use violence, let's consider breaking away, let's embrace our heritage, let's bring that back, pay back for slavery, all these types of things. Well, meanwhile, you got Martin Luther King and the SCLC and the NAACP sitting here. Nonviolence is still better. Nonviolence is still better. Martin Luther King is going to change his stance a little bit. He's not going to ever totally embrace the militant approach, but he is going to get to the point where he starts questioning complete nonviolence. And this is when he is assaulted in Chicago. In 1966, Martin Luther King goes to Chicago because he wants to see what race relationships in the North are like. He's been focusing a lot of his attention on the South, but he knows that many of the inner cities in North are also experiencing similar civil rights issues. And so particularly in terms of housing as well as economic justice. And so they go up, he and other SCLC leadership go to Chicago. They're like, this is one of the biggest cities in the North. Let's see what type of urban problems that the Black people up here are facing. And so while he's up there, there's a whole bunch of threats made against his life, as well as the life of his family. They're like, what are you doing? We were supporting you when you were in the South, but now you're putting a spotlight up here and showing us to be bad. We're not down with that. And so a lot of the white people in Chicago reacted really violently. One even threw a rock, like a giant stone, at Martin Luther King's head when he was just taking a peaceful march through a Chicago neighborhood. He winds up being okay, but it becomes apparent that there is this little bit of a white backlash starting against the civil rights movement. You know, the reform movement had kind of just started to stall as you have all these different groups and all this different infighting within the movement. It wasn't as unified as a whole. In addition, President Johnson had started stalling to ask for more reforms. He's like, I've passed as much legislation as I can possibly think of that I can actually carry out. I don't like that this violence is increasing, but now you know, within your own civil rights movement, you're out there promoting violence. And what am I supposed to do when you're promoting violence? It's hard to sell legislation. In huge cities, urban violence often broke out where various groups clashed, leading to deaths and arrests. There were over 100 riots alone between 1965 and 1967. And there's a lot of people who say Detroit was one of the areas that was the worst. Detroit alone had 43 people killed in these race riots over the course of these 2 years. And a federal report by this group called the Kerner Commission said that white racism was largely responsible for the tension, right? The racist people who were white, who didn't like the black people trying to push for change in the North, are now seeking violence. The Kerner Commission said our nation is moving to two different societies, one black, one white, one separate and unequal. And so it was just this huge collision where things were spiraling massively out of control. You can see some of the images from this. So Martin Luther King realizes he's got to make a change. He doesn't want to completely embrace all of the Black Panther movement's ideas, right? But he does like some of their ideas, especially the need for blacks to gain more economic power. He also was upset that Johnson had started spending less money on civil rights and Great Society programs and more money on the war with Vietnam. And so what's going to happen is Martin Luther King comes up with this idea of creating another march. And this one was going to be in March of 1968. And he called it the Poor People's Campaign. And his goal was get a whole bunch of poor people to march to Washington again, because the March on Washington in '63 had been so successful. Before this march was going to happen, on his way, he went to Memphis, Tennessee to show his support for some sanitation workers who just happened to be on strike. There were black garbage men who were not being paid as well as the white garbage men, so the black garbage men had gone on strike. He wanted to say he supported that. On the evening of April 4th, 1968, he goes out of, he was staying at the Lorraine Motel, and he went out onto the terrace to make a speech. And while he was doing this, a man from the crowd named James Earl Ray fired a shot, and from allegedly from a room across the way, and shot and killed Martin Luther King. So Martin Luther King was assassinated, and this makes him a huge martyr to the civil rights cause. In the wake of his death, riots and outrage are going to spread across the country. After he was killed, Ralph Abernathy is going to take over the leadership of the SCLC, but he does not have near the charisma that Martin Luther King had, and so gradually the SCLC is going to decrease in terms of strength. He does continue with Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign. They get to DC. He creates what's called Resurrection City, which was kind of this miniature town, like a shanty town, made out of tents and cardboard boxes. And the idea that was they were going to stay there until they were listened to. But there was a lot of rain that deteriorated the boxes and the housing, a lot of theft and a lot of violence. And it was just a huge city that was basically a disaster. It was torn down after a couple of months without having really achieved any goals. And in the absence of Martin Luther King, by the 1970s, the SCLC had deteriorated. And here you can see images from the Resurrection City. Without Martin Luther King in the picture, and with the strongest of the peaceful groups now losing all power, the militants have a little bit of power, but just for a little bit of time.